Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us in another story from long time ago. Tell me if you'd like. Where are you listening from? And what time is it right now? Comment below and let us know in comment section. So where did it all begin? How and when did mining first start in England? Well, that's what we'll find out today. And I can tell you it's much earlier than you might think. But first, if you love all things medieval and even things pre-medieval, then please consider subscribing. Let's get started. And we're off to an early medieval England. That's right, because England's mining boom actually began in the 12th, 13th centuries. And don't forget, this was at a time when England wasn't even called England. It was still known as England. But we'll give our medieval miners their due. They were hard at work extracting iron, tin, lead, silver, and coal from the depths of the earth. In fact, during the Anglo-Saxon period, evidence suggests that native English people were already smelting iron ore. However, there isn't much documentation about who was doing the work or the scale on which it was happening. So let's fast forward to those boom times in the 12th century. Now, during this era, England's population had swelled with people looking for new opportunities after the Norman conquest of 1066. These folks relocated away from the congested towns and cities and into more rural areas where they established small communities and carried out small-scale mining. This method was used to extract relatively shallow deposits of minerals. Early miners worked these open-pit mines near to where they lived. Bell pits was another name given to these types of shafts. The word bell comes from the Old English word for well. And while the term bell pit may conjure up images of pirate booty, the reality was far less glamorous. A bell pit was simply a type of mine shaft dug by hand, typically 20 feet deep, although sometimes reaching up to 60 feet. These pits would have been found across England during the early medieval period, especially in southeast and central regions, where tin, lead, and silver were being extracted. And while it's hard to imagine how archaeologists know where these bell pits are located today, it's quite simple. The pits were often square or circular and could be spotted thanks to the distinctive heaps of waste material or tailings around them. Tailings are what remain after useful minerals have been extracted, and these are often rich in other minerals. Today, they're a key source of secondary minerals, but in medieval times, they were seen as worthless. So they were just dumped close to the pits. As the demand for certain minerals grew during the medieval period, so too did the depth of the bell pits. Eventually, miners were delving 75 feet below ground in some instances. And it was around this time that they were forced to contend with water ingress. And that's not something you want in a mine. You know, flooding. So miners had to install pumps and other devices to keep the water at bay. But as technology improved, they were able to reach deeper and richer mineral seams. Water, however, remained a problem until the 19th century, when steam-powered pumps finally made it safe to dig much further below ground. Another issue that plagued miners throughout history was cave-ins. Cave-ins are the worst thing that can happen to a miner. There's very little warning of one, and very little chance of escape once it happens. While it's impossible to know the true death toll of mining in England, it's safe to assume that many miners perished in cave-ins over the years. Indeed, that was the fate of Hugh Meredith, who was killed in a caving accident at the Swaledale lead mine in Yorkshire in 1696. He was entombed in a chamber 40 feet below ground, and his body could not be recovered for 2 weeks. But now let us head to the Forest of Dean in Gloucestershire and look at the evidence of mining here. In the Doomsday Book survey of 1086, there is no mention of mining in the Forest of Dean, but by the end of the 11th century, there were several settlements here. By 1150, however, the population had grown, and the area was providing iron ore, lead, copper, silver, and gold to the English economy. Now, this region was unique because in most of medieval England, ores had to be sent to external sources for smelting. But the Forest of Dean provided a ready supply of charcoal needed for the task. And this meant that miners could stay close to home and smelt their ore. During the medieval period, iron production increased steadily here, and in 1252, King Henry III granted a group of monks permission to construct a furnace and a forge to produce iron for their own use. However, by the 14th century, iron production had dropped in the Forest of Dean, possibly due to competition from continental Europe. Also, demand for iron never really waned. But other minerals came to the fore in the following centuries. For example, tin mining was huge in Cornwall. In fact, by the 14th century, Cornwall produced a quarter of the total output of tin in Europe. At this time, tin was needed for both its intrinsic value and as a crucial ingredient in the production of bronze. Tin streaming, as it was called, was hard, dirty work. Miners would walk through streams, carrying a weighted basket on their back, moving from rock pool to rock pool, and carefully washing the gravel to extract tiny flecks of tin. It was incredibly laborious and dangerous work, and often took place on private land without the landowner's permission. In fact, in 1305, the men of Penwith in Cornwall were charged with trespassing and stealing tin. And as a result, they were banned from tin streaming. But this didn't last long, and soon the men were back in the streams. However, not all mining was on such a small scale. For instance, in County Durham, vast open-air smelt works were constructed alongside rivers, taking advantage of the power of water. Here, large quantities of iron were produced and supplied to local monasteries and the royal mint. Some of this iron was even exported to Norway. In 1183, when King John granted the Abbot of Durham the right to export iron and coal from his port of import, the king stipulated that some of the iron must be used to make cannons for the royal army. So now let's talk about silver mining, because it had a profound impact on the English economy. You see, silver was discovered near Carlisle in 1133. It was mined at the Clybourne mine, now known as the Allenheads Smelt Mill. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, this precious metal was found by two shepherds whose flock had strayed onto the hillside. When they climbed higher to retrieve their animals, they noticed small veins of silver among the rocks. As news spread of this discovery, large numbers of prospectors descended on the area. But only those with royal permission could mine for silver legally. So a series of laws was enacted to regulate the industry. These laws stated that silver must be weighed and measured in London, and that those who found the ore should receive 1 shilling and 8 pence per pudding. A pudding, by the way, was equal to 4 pounds avoirdupois. Many prospectors flocked to the area and built small settlements near the mines. Within decades, the village of Allendale Town had sprung up. This is thought to be the first purpose-built mining town in England. Of course, like anywhere else, there were slums as well as grander homes. And living conditions were cramped and unsanitary. Fires were common, spreading easily from one rickety building to the next. Also, as in any town, criminals lurked here too, including highwaymen. In fact, Allendale was notorious for its pickpockets. Nevertheless, for many, The lure of striking it rich was too strong to resist. And it wasn't just prospectors who were drawn to the promise of silver. Royalty had an eye on the potential revenue from taxes. And as a result, the kings of England granted extensive mining rights to local lords. The profits from the mines were so great that they even funded a war with Scotland in 1157. However, by the 12th century, the richest veins of silver had been exhausted. And when the price of silver fell in 1296, the industry declined further. This decline was worsened by the Black Death pandemic, which led to a shortage of labor. And this resulted in the collapse of the lead mining industry in the region. So there you have it, the beginnings of mining in medieval England. From the humble bell pits to the rise and fall of Allendale, England's first purpose-built mining town. What do you think? Were you surprised by any of the information? Let me know in the comments section. Thanks for watching. Please remember to subscribe. We'd love to have it if you did. Thanks again and take care. It's 1284 and your village needs lead for roofing its church. So off to the mines you go, lad. Don't worry, it'll be fine. Just remember what they told you about ventilation and don't start a riot or anything. But if you survive the mines, you'll have an epic tale to tell. You know, one that includes bloody noses, copious amounts of farting, and that time the overseer got crushed by a wheelbarrow. Oh, and also, death dot. Yeah, there's a lot of death down here. This is what it was like mining deep in medieval England. So you read deep in the belly of the earth, with nothing but the flickering light of your candle to illuminate the darkness, and a pickaxe and shovel to break up the rock around you, a wheelbarrow to haul away the riches, and possibly a wooden winch, and basket to get yourself out of the shaft you've there been digging for hours. Because despite their back-breaking work, medieval miners still had to follow safety protocols. Well, maybe someone wrote them down somewhere. No one really knows. But the men who worked in the English mines knew that inhaling enough coal dust would kill you faster than any cave-in ever could. And no overseer wanted their best worker to expire from a nasty cough and turn into a statistic, though that wasn't really possible, since no one was keeping track of statistics yet. The tools of the trade were simple but effective, though. Picks and shovels were used just like today, except when those two weren't enough to pry loose the stubborn rock, and miners used long-handled scoops like those on modern subway trains. Wheelbarrows were used in larger mines, though smaller ones just used baskets. Sometimes a rope was attached to a windlass or winch to pull full baskets of ore or rock to the surface. Winch baskets could carry between half a last and 2 lasts of material, with a last being a medieval dry unit equal to about 23 gallons or 87 liters. A number of different metals were mined across England during the Middle Ages, including gold, silver, tin, copper, lead, and iron. Tin and copper were imported to England from other countries where it was easier to mine them, so they didn't garner as much attention as the precious metals. That said, there was a huge silver boom starting in the 1160s after large veins of the metal were found in mid-Wales. This led to a silver rush and a sharp increase in production, which continued into the 1260s when vast quantities of silver were extracted at the Quymystwyth and other mines near the town of Newcastle Emlyn. Once the silver ran out, the mines were abandoned, and the area became known as the Land of the Lost. Ouch! Meanwhile, the mines that produced base metals like lead were in constant operation because they were needed for everything from roofing to paint pigment to ammunition. The richest seams of lead were in the southwest of England, particularly around the Mendip Hills in Somerset, and the Forest of Dean in Gloucestershire, with smaller mines also found in Cumberland, Westmoreland, and Derbyshire. Since there was a relatively high concentration of lead in the soil, miners were able to use fairly rudimentary techniques to extract it, especially water power. As early as Roman times, water wheels powered drainage pumps to keep the mines free of water. In fact, records show that King Alfred the Great paid a miner named Wulfstan 4 shillings and 8 pence in the year 946 to repair a water wheel at Glastonbury Abbey. These wheels also powered the bellows for the bloomery furnaces used to smelt metal. Bloomery smelting was an early method of refining metal that involved heating the ore to drive off impurities. The resulting metal was far from pure, but it was pure enough to be used for many purposes. For example, it could be traded to a specialty refinery to make items like church bells. Despite the fact that water power was available, medieval English mines were often dark, dank, dirty places. The air was thick with dust, and miners wore eye protectors made of leather or linen to shield themselves against flying rock and minerals. They dressed simply in homespun woolen trousers tucked into knee boots and shirts. Some wore doublets over their shirts for additional protection, while others went completely nude except for their headgear, which might have consisted of a linen cap or a leather skull cap. Everyone wore a belt to hold up their trousers, and some had braces for added support, though this was the standard attire for miners everywhere. Bosses sometimes insisted that their men wear distinctive clothing so that they could unescape by blending in with the local population. Now, if you've ever been underground, you know that when you do need to relieve yourself, you dig yourself a little hole and cover it with dirt and hope no one steps in it. Back in the Middle Ages, they did things the same way, only they took it a step further. Sometimes called public convenience shafts or privy holes. These latrines were typically located at the end of a level or near the foot of a ladder. There were usually 2 holes side by side, one for solid waste and one for liquids, though the latter was occasionally used for the former as well. To keep things sanitary, the contents of the toilets were removed as regularly as possible and used for fertilizer on nearby farms. Don't look at me like that, Dot, back then. Fertilizer was worth its weight in gold. Literally. Of course, along with the normal business of mining, the men would stop and fart around for a bit and play games. One such game, kicking the closet, involved kicking a ball across a room using only the back part of the foot. Another favorite was a dice game called Lek Mich im Arsch, which I won't translate because YouTube will probably take my card if I do. To avoid spending too much time playing games, overseers would keep a sharp eye on their workers, especially since miners had a bad habit of going on strike. In the absence of labor laws, medieval miners relied on a system called the custom of miners to regulate working conditions. One provision dictated that if an overseer fell asleep on the job, his men were free to leave. This right of distress applied to other situations as well. If the air grew too stale or the roof too unstable, the miners could pack up and head home without fear of punishment. But perhaps the most important provision of the custom of miners guaranteed the right of wago, which allowed miners to travel to and from work in groups for mutual protection. This right extended to roads built by miners, which were often laid out in networks of bell pits and tunnels under hillsides and through rivers. These were not only used to transport ore, but to travel between towns and even act as shortcuts through the countryside. However, miners were expected to restore the land above ground to its original state. Unless the custom of the land granted them permission to keep the spoils. For all the talk of rights and customs, though, the harsh reality was that the life of a medieval miner was cheap. Accidents were common and deadly. The narrow tunnels were prone to collapse, and death by suffocation was always looming in the stale, dusty air. Furthermore, when strikes did occur, owners could hire replacement workers from another area or simply wait until the men returned to work. All of these factors contributed to a brutal cycle of high injury and death rates, coupled with a steady flow of new recruits willing to work for low wages in the dangerous and demeaning conditions. But one day you won't be coming home from the mines. Your shift ends and you don't make it out of the tunnel before it collapses, trapping you and your fellow miners deep in the belly of the earth. Or maybe you inhale too much dust and return home looking for fresh air, never to leave again. Or perhaps you fall asleep on the job and get disciplined, then decide to go on strike, and your boss just hires someone else. Hey, it happens. If you want to learn more about what happened to the people who lived in England in the Middle Ages, check out our series on medieval life. And hey, thanks for watching. Deep in the earth, far from the light of day, men toiled in darkness. The air was thick with danger, each swing of their pickaxe echoing the precariousness of their lives. They were mining deep in medieval England, where fortunes were made and lost, all in the pursuit of precious metals. Their world was one of hardship, grime, and peril, yet they were vital to the economy of their time. So what was it really like to be a miner in medieval England? Welcome to my channel. Today, we're exploring medieval mining. Their workday began before sunrise. As the sun peaked over the horizon, these men descended into the belly of the earth, carrying with them their tools and a flickering lantern. The shaft was their lifeline, a narrow passage that spiraled down into the darkness. There they would toil for hours, hacking away at the bedrock with pickaxes. The rhythmic clang resonated through the tunnels, a grim symphony of labor. But as the hours passed, the air grew stale and heavy. Ventilation was scarce, and the shafts were often filled with noxious fumes. This was especially true during smelting, when the air grew thick with toxic sulfur dioxide and carbon monoxide. Miners had no choice but to endure this poisonous atmosphere. If they were lucky, a light breeze might stir, offering a brief respite from the stifling air. But more often than not, the only movement was the slow, agonizing creep of time itself. To make matters worse, flooding was a constant threat. Without proper drainage, water would seep into the tunnels, turning the mine into a watery grave. It was a nightmare that haunted every miner's waking moment. And all too often, the ground above would collapse, leaving those trapped inside to face a suffocating demise. The darkness was absolute, impenetrable. It clung to the miners like a shroud, obscuring not just their vision, but also any hope of escape. Yet they pressed on, guided by the faint glimmer of their lanterns, driven by the promise of riches that lay hidden in the earth's cold embrace. But it wasn't just the elements that threatened their lives. Deep within the earth, far from the prying eyes of the world, a different kind of danger lurked. In the pitch-black depths, accidents were not just frequent, they were inevitable. Men could and did lose their limbs, sometimes even their lives, in the blink of an eye. The absence of safety measures meant that every swing of the pickaxe was a gamble, every step a potential slip into the abyss. There was no safety net, no rescue operation waiting in the shadows. If you fell alone. And then there was the ever-present threat of fire. From a single errant spark, A tiny ember escaping a miner's lantern could ignite the treacherous dust, turning the entire mine into an inferno. Trapped deep underground, the miners had little chance against the flames. Escape seemed like a distant fantasy, and the searing heat was a grim reminder of their fragility in this unforgiving underworld. They lived in a world where even the simplest task could be a matter of life and death. For instance, the job of lighting their way through the darkness, entrusted to a special group of miners called tramps. They carried flaming pine splints known as trams. These fiery staffs were more than just sources of light. They were lifelines in the oppressive darkness. But transporting these burning torches through narrow passages was a perilous task. One wrong move and the tram could be extinguished. Plunging the tunnels into impenetrable darkness or worse, the torch could ignite the deadly coal dust, turning the mine into a fiery tomb. As the hours crawled by, the air grew thicker, heavier, making each breath a laborious effort. A deafening silence was broken only by the rasp of their own breathing, the drip of water echoing like a dirge. The pressure mounted, not just in the confined space, but also in their chests. Panic threatened to rise, clawing at their throats. Claustrophobia pressed in, a tangible force that seemed to squeeze the very breath out of their lungs. In this subterranean hell, even hope seemed to wither and die. Then came the long climb back up the shaft, a test of both endurance and nerve. The narrow, winding staircase seemed endless. With each step, the miners hoped they were nearing the exit, but the darkness was their constant companion. The shaft became a battleground where their will to survive was put to the ultimate test. In those rare moments when they breached the surface, they emerged blinking into the sunlight, their bodies aching, their lungs burning for the fresh air. When they finally staggered out of the mine, it was as if they were reborn. The sunlight felt warm on their skin, the wind a soothing balm on their scorched lungs. But this brief reprieve was only temporary, for they were drawn back to the darkness, pulled by the same forces that had brought them here. They knew the risks, the dangers, the grim toll that this life exacted. Yet they returned, driven by the relentless need to survive, to provide, to endure. But their ordeal didn't end at the mouth of the mine. Life above ground was no less harsh. The village of G, nestled near the foot of the Emily Moors, was a community deeply entwined with the grim realities of mining. Its history was etched in the very fabric of the land, a testament to the relentless human spirit that refused to be broken by the darkest of circumstances. These miners were not just laborers. They were part of a social order that was defined by their work. Their world revolved around the rhythms of the mine, the ebb and flow of fortune that depended on the whims of the market and the bounty of the earth. Their homes were modest, often little more than one-room affairs that barely offered shelter from the elements. The walls bore the scars of countless seasons, and the roof leaked whenever the heavens opened up. Yet within those rough-hewn walls, they found solace and community. Each evening when the miners returned home, they brought with them the grime and the weariness of their day. The scent of damp earth clung to their clothes, and the grime of the mine shaft painted lines on their faces. But it was a badge of honor, a symbol of their hard-won survival. Within the close-knit community of G, they found camaraderie, a shared understanding born out of the daily struggles they faced together. Religion played a pivotal role in their lives. For these men and women, faith was a source of strength, a beacon in the darkness that both pervaded their daily lives and mirrored their world literally. The village church stood as a sentinel against the encroaching darkness, its spire reaching towards the heavens. Its bells tolled not just to mark the hours, but to summon them for prayer, for solace, and for unity. Within the church's hallowed halls, they sought refuge, finding comfort in the words of their faith. Their prayers were laden with the hopes and fears that gnawed at their hearts, their pleas echoing the desperate need for a life less fraught with peril. But even in the face of such hardships, life went on. Children were born and christened in the village, their tiny hands gripping the fingers of their parents, symbolizing the continuity of life amidst the darkness. Weddings were celebrated, bringing a rare burst of joy and unity. The union of two souls was a defiant act against the backdrop of their harsh reality, a testament to the enduring power of love. Funerals were somber affairs, the villagers coming together to lay their dead to rest. The weight of each burial was heavy, each grave a stark reminder of the toll that their world exacted. They found ways to celebrate the small victories, to laugh in the face of adversity, and to love despite the darkness that threatened to consume them. In their acts of defiance, they wove a tapestry of resilience, a vibrant testament to the unbreakable spirit of humanity. Yet they weren't merely survivors, they were dreamers too. In the quiet moments, when the darkness was at its most oppressive, they dreamt of a different life, a life less shadowed by danger, less burdened by hardship. They dreamt of a future where the minds yielded not just sustenance, but also hope, where the earth's dark womb would offer them not just a struggle for survival, but a chance at happiness. These dreams were their anchors, keeping them afloat in the darkest days, reminding them that even in the heart of darkness, the human spirit could endure, could hope, and could dream of a brighter dawn. This has been What It Was Like, and if you want to find out more about life in medieval England, check out the series in the description below.